When you come across videos and pictures of Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of the Chechen Republic, on social media, he looks and behaves exactly as you would expect a barbaric warlord to. This controversial man is a piece in the bigger puzzle of Putin's reign in Russia, and many people have given him the nickname Putin's foot soldier. His role is to rule over the Russian Republic of Chechnya and continue to silence and dispel anything that comes out against the Kremlin. And what he has done is caused more trouble for Putin than he has been worth. The insurgency and war in the North Caucasus has been the absolute bane of Putin's existence, and he is beginning to question how helpful his little puppet is in all of this mess. Eventually, Kadyrov's habit of making powerful enemies and violating basic human rights will make him more of a nuisance, and his stance as a Putin ally may change.
I wanted to ask you about the alleged roundup, abduction, and torture of gay men in the Republic. What, Mr. President, do you want to say about that?
Вот сейчас, к чему почему он приехал, пришел к тому, да, вопросу, да, это ерунда. У нас таких людей нету. Нету у нас геев. Если есть, заберите в Канаду, хвала Аллаху, подальше от нас. Аузу билляхи минаш шайтанир раджим, да. Чтобы не было, да, чтобы очистили кровь, там, если есть таких, пусть забирают там.
This is what happens when you set something up as a foothold and it becomes the rock that pierces you. Now, we want to bring informative content like this, but sometimes we have to push back against Putin's bots under our videos. So to help us do this, please like our videos and share them with your friends and family. We really appreciate it. We like to begin most of these discussions at the time that Russia swooped in and took over. But what was Chechnya before the Soviet Union, or even before Ramzan Kadyrov? The region of Chechnya is situated in the North Caucasus of Eastern Europe, and it is well known for its mountainous terrain and beautiful lakes. The original settlers in the region were known as the Chechen people, who are historically known as Kisti and Derzuks. They started out as the Northeast Caucasus ethnic group called the Nakh peoples, which was native to the North Caucasus, and they were the largest ethnic group in the region. It's important to note that this massive region called the North Caucasus inhabits more than just the Chechens and Chechnya. It slopes upwards towards the main ridge of the Caucasus Mountains and is considered the border between Europe and Asia. Although the Chechens make up the majority of the region, you also have the Abkhaz, the Inggush, and the Lezgi, which are much smaller population groups. The main language that this group of people speak is Chechen, which is a lowland dialect originated from the Nakh people. The language is closely related to Inggush, which is spoken in neighboring Ingushetia, and Chechens use the Georgian, Arabic, and Latin alphabets at different points in history. Even now, with them under Russian control, their main language is still Chechen. Prior to the adoption of Islam in the region, the Chechens practiced a mixed bag of religious traditions and beliefs. Due to how important farming was in the region, they celebrated a lot of rain rites and prayed to the goddess Tusholi for harvest. The region became Islamic, and the majority of Chechens are Sunni Muslims. So before we get into the sad stories of the defeat after defeat that the Chechens faced when they came up against the Russian Empire, let us squeeze in the legend of one of the greatest Chechen warriors of all time. Islam arrived in Chechnya in the 19th century, and around that time, the great Imam Shamil appeared on the scene. This mujahid will forever be remembered because he led the first strong resistance against Tsarist Russia. The Russian Empire was just coming off the high of defeating the Napoleonic Empire and decided that it wanted to take over the North Caucasus once and for all. The only thing standing in their way was this great leader. Shamil was a triple threat, a military commander, diplomat, and a politician too. Russian history would love to paint him as an extremist and a fanatic, but that was far from the truth. He was actually quite pragmatic. When he first came into power in the 1830s, Shamil attempted to negotiate conditions for peace with Russian leaders, agreeing to accept sovereignty of the Russian Tsar in exchange for recognition of the Sharia as a valid legal system in the regions they occupied. The Russians were not willing to hear this compromise and felt like they were superior to the savages who were trying to negotiate terms with them. After the negotiations fell through, they made the fatal mistake of engaging in war with Shamil. This was probably one of the most embarrassing times for the Russian Empire. Imam Shamil created the military theocratic state of Dagestan and Chechnya, and for a quarter of a century, they raised hell against the Russian Empire. Starting in 1836, the Tsar's army tried to launch a series of violent campaigns against the Highlanders. but the resistance forces were very strong. In 1840, a great uprising broke out and managed to push the Tsar's army out of Dagestan and Chechnya. This moment was monumental and showed that it was possible to resist the Great Tsar. Shamil understood that the only hope for the Northern Caucasus region against Russia was to unite. So he brought together highland ethnic groups into a uniform confederation of states with a single civil and military system. At some point, these territories even included the northwestern and central Caucasus. Shamil put up a good fight, but after 25 years, the region was tired of fighting and defeat finally came. Some of Shamil's forces had already begun to break away, and many Dagestani and Chechen chieftains proclaimed loyalty to the Tsar. Shamil first fled Dagestan for Chechnya and then eventually surrendered to the Tsar in 1859. Still, everything that he did for Chechnya became symbolic to the people, and it still drives the desire that the Chechens have for independence. A lot of the imagery of strong Chechen soldiers and their warrior-like style of resistance was built from the legends of Imam Shamil. During the Battle of Gonib, Imam Shamil proved himself to be a true warrior. In the middle of the fight, Shamil found himself surrounded by a sea of Russian soldiers, but he was planning on getting out of there alive. Shamil launched himself off the elevated stoop, soaring over the heads of his enemies, and sliced through them with one movement. 3 soldiers fell to the ground, but a 4th, fueled by rage, lunged towards him with his bayonet, and his blade pierced Shamil's side. Instead of falling to the ground, in one movement, Shamil yanked the bayonet out of his own flesh and sent it flying back into the soldier's chest. After this, he leapt over the wall and vanished into the darkness. The Russians were left in shock, not knowing what to do. And that is how Imam Shamil earned his legacy. Even Tsar Nicholas had so much respect for him that when he surrendered, he was not killed but exiled to Kaluga, Russia. In a letter to Tsar King Nicholas, these were some of his famous last words. "I am Shamil, who is the lowest of those Muslims who struggle for the independence and freedom of the Caucasus. I am an honest Muslim who swears not to exchange the protection of Allah for the lordship of the Tsar. I stated to General Kluganov before that I would not recognize the Tsar Nicholas I and that his authority is not valid in these mountains." After the strong resistance led by Imam Shamil, the Tsarist regime realized it needed to pivot. In order to reduce the strength of the Northern Caucasus, they offered the Chechens and Ingush an opportunity to leave for the Ottoman Empire. About 80% of the Chechens and Ingush left, which weakened the resistance. Many small fighters tried to build up their small units, but the most that they would do was harass Russian military convoys, government mints, and government post service, mainly in Ingushetia and Chechnya. But before the Soviet Union swept in, the Northern Caucasus had a momentary glimpse of freedom. On the 21st of December 1917, Ingushetia, Chechnya, and Dagestan declared independence from Russia and formed a single state. United Mountain Dwellers of the North Caucasus. It seemed like everything that people had been fighting for was finally happening. But that was all wishful thinking. In 1921, the Russians attacked and occupied the country and forcibly absorbed the region. And then the years of terror under the Soviet Union began. Do you remember the history of the traumatic time under Stalin? Well, during his reign, the people of Chechnya greatly suffered. In 1944, more mass deportations happened, and it was clear that they were attempting to rid the area of the brave Chechens. They had watched how well they had fought against Nazi Germany during the Second World War and decided that it would be dangerous to keep them around. The brave Chechens and Ingush had been falsely accused of being Nazi supporters, and over 60% of the population was packed into trucks, and those who could not be moved were simply shot. While it was happening, the world just sat back and watched on. And only later in the early 2000s would people finally be brave enough to admit that it was a genocide. After Stalin was removed in 1956, they were able to return to Chechnya, but the trauma had already been created. What was even more confusing was that when they came back, even their home was not the same. Many Russian migrants from other parts of the Soviet Union had settled into their abandoned family homes, and now the Russian language and way of life were dominating everything. It was all doom and gloom after that. But then things finally seemed to be looking up for Chechnya when the dissolution of the Soviet Union became a reality. Chechnya had watched as the Baltic states had broken off and decided it was their time. An independence movement started growing, and it was led by ex-Soviet Air Force General and new Chechen president, Dzhokhar Dudayev. At this time, Boris Yeltsin was setting up the Russian Federation, and he could not afford to lose any more territories. His argument was that Chechnya had not been an independent entity, the way the Baltics and other Caucasian states, such as Georgia, had been, so it did not have the right to be free. Disheartening, right? At this point, Chechnya thought it was finally going to catch a break here, but it was still stuck with Russia. Of course, Chechnya did not take that lying down, and in November of 1991, Dadayev's Chechnya issued a unilateral declaration of independence. This move started another decade of fighting that was called the Chechen Wars.
Значит, там пакуете, и мы вас, скорее всего, вы, наверное, вперед нас привезете, чем мы. Вот. Ну,
Когда бежали, да?
Остался я и вот. Все. Все. Остальное все на мне.
Оттуда бежали.
Нет,
The Chechen Wars were as big as they were because of the religious aspect. The Chechen leader Ahmed Kadyrov was a bearded Muslim scholar turned guerrilla commander who declared jihad on all Russians and ordered that each Chechen had to kill at least 150 Russians. This war should have been a clean sweep for Russia, considering its superiority in troops, weaponry, and air support, but embarrassingly, the Russian forces were unable to establish effective permanent control over the mountainous area, due to how well the Chechnya army carried out its guerrilla warfare. While they chose to hide away from full-scale battles, the Chechen rebels did very well in insurgency raids. The warriors were daring and succeeded by planning bold attacks, like the Bujansk hospital hostage crisis. This attack happened in 1995, but it seemed like the type of thing that you would watch in an action movie right now. Led by Shamil Basayev, the Chechnyan militants took over the hospital in Russia and were in control of about 2,000 hostages. The group was small, about 100 militants, but they managed to cover the entire premises. They demanded the release of Chechen prisoners and the withdrawal of Russian forces from Chechnya and the recognition of Chechnyan independence. At first, Russia was in denial, and then it eventually negotiated some of the terms and released the Chechnya prisoners. Outside of making President Boris Yeltsin look bad, this incident also increased international sympathy for Chechnya and put the spotlight on Russia. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, Boris had made a lot of fanfare about moving towards pushing for democratic freedoms for former Soviet states. And now, he was caught out in his lie. The First Chechen War made Chechnya look good, and the army was seen as the brave David who took down a Goliath. As a last-ditch attempt to save face, the Russians assassinated the elected president of Chechnya, Jokhar Dadayev, using a phone signal to fire a missile at his location. This action did not do what Russia thought it would do, and it only fanned the flames of the Second Chechen War. As the story's been going on for the past couple of months, we know the good things that happened in Chechnya have never happened for long. After the First War, there was a brief time of stability, but this time the Chechens were their own undoing. Instead of relishing in the success of having defeated an outside army, internal struggles began. After the war, parliamentary and presidential elections took place in January of 1997 in Chechnya, and President Aslan Maskhadov was elected as the chief of staff and prime minister in the Chechen coalition government for a 5-year term. Reconstruction began, and Russia had started contributing to fixing the formal economy and infrastructure it had destroyed. It started sending money for the rehabilitation of the republic and provided funds for schools and hospitals. And then, all of a sudden, the strangest practice began in Chechnya. Kidnapping became a big problem, and kidnappers would make money from collecting ransoms. Over $200 million was made during the 3-year independence of the state. And in 1998, 176 people were kidnapped. Most of these criminal activities were widely political and religiously motivated. Wahhabism, which is a radical Islamic ideology, had become rife at the time. And in 1998, Grozny authorities declared a state of emergency. This hot mess was the perfect place for Russia to make its reappearance in Chechen history. In 1999, some apartment bombs killed 300 people in some Russian cities, and of course, the blame immediately went to Chechen separatists. Some journalists could see it for what it was and immediately blamed the Russian Secret Service for blowing up the buildings to initiate a new military campaign against Chechnya. This time around, Russia was much better organized and prepared for the Second Chechen War. Of course, the guerrilla fighters and the Chechens wanted to keep the fight up, and in 2002, they tried to stage another hostage situation by taking control of a Moscow theater with about 900 civilian hostage. This one did not end well for them, and about 117 hostages and 50 rebels ended up dead. In response to this extremism, Russia tightened its grip, and it was in this whole mess that Putin began to emerge. But before we get into Putin's hand in Chechnya, we need to talk about why the fight for the region was so strong. Surely, after so much resistance, Russia could have taken the hint, right? Well, no. Chechnya was a major hub in the oil infrastructure of Russia, and hence, separation from Russia would hurt the country's economy and energy access. The northern Caucasus region is vital because it gives Russia access to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Chechnya also lies on the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, which carries oil to Europe. By now, we know how big the oil business is for Russia, so it's no surprise that holding on to Chechnya is a big part of keeping the country's economics afloat. From a logistical standpoint as well, Chechnya is like Russia's little gateway to the North Caucasus. Take a look at this map. You can see from here how Chechnya actually joins Russia to the rest of the region. It borders Dagestan, Ingushetia, and Georgia, making it a critical hub for Russia's work in those areas. We can also see how close it is to Turkey in the Middle East, which makes it Russia's little trade haven. The Middle East is responsible for about 20% of Russia's arms trades, and Saudi Arabia has always been one of Russia's top oil partners. Russia has worked on strengthening its relations with countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia for such a long time, and Chechen randomly separating is going to make things a lot harder for it. At this stage of the game, Russia has invested in infrastructure, transport systems, and urban development. There is no way it is letting all of that money and time simply go down the toilet. Russia is also way too paranoid about the extremism in Chechnya to let it go unchecked. Its hold on the region is also a counterterrorism measure that is meant to keep the region in peace. Its past terrorist acts have not been forgotten, and Russia cannot be sure that if they separate, Chechnya will not be coming for the Kremlin. The battle is religious as well, and the forces of Orthodox Christianity and Islam are fighting for dominance in the region of Eastern Europe. This fight is also an ego thing for the Kremlin. Russia gets to save face in the northern Caucasus by being in control of Chechnya. It is kind of its way of saying, hey, I know I lost all the other regions, but look, I'm still in control of this one. It seems, well, a little pathetic, but it is a motivation. The imperialist history is still a big part of the Russian identity, and it truly believes that one day it's going to return to its former days of glory. Chechnya has also embarrassed Russia too much throughout the years, and that is never going away for Moscow. Russia also does not want to look like it is giving in to its international community's demands, so it's going to fight this one out to the bitter end. As all of this was going down, we must not assume that the international community was sitting quietly. From the get-go, in the 1990s, President Clinton was very vocal about the violence in Chechnya.
As the tragic events in Chechnya remind us today, Chechnya is part of the Russian Federation, and we support the territorial integrity of Russia, just as we support the territorial integrity of all its neighbors. But the violence must end. I call again on all the parties to stop spilling blood and start making peace.
Clinton put a lot of pressure on then Russian President Boris Yeltsin to negotiate with the Chechen rebels because he believed that if they came to some sort of agreement, the violence would stop. The human rights abuses that were happening also made a lot of international organizations become involved, and the United Nations and the European Union criticized the region very loudly for their human rights abuses. This did not really have much of an impact though because, as we know from recent history, Russia does not really care about what the international community thinks of it. During the Bush administration, the US and Russia had similar disagreements, and US officials once again called on President Vladimir Putin to put an end to human rights violations in Chechnya. In recent years, the cry for Chechnya has sort of died out as the focus has turned to fighting for Ukraine's territorial integrity. Other former Soviet countries have also tried to fight with Chechnya. Countries like Georgia, Turkey, and Azerbaijan have had very strong cultural and historical ties with the region, and they have a shared interest in seeing Chechnya free. Georgia has always offered refuge to Chechen fighters, and Azerbaijan has let Chechen leaders operate from Baku. Even Ukraine at some point was fighting for Chechnya, which is a very cruel irony since Chechen fighters have fought alongside Russia in its invasion of Ukraine. While the international community has been sympathetic to Chechnya's plight, it has not been enough to push Russia out, and when Putin came along, things only got worse. According to Stanislav Belkovsky, a Moscow-based political analyst, for years, Vladimir Putin saw the pacification of Chechnya as his main achievement. In that respect, Putin has a colossal psychological dependence on Chechnya and Ramzan Kadyrov, who ensured the pacification. As the Prime Minister of Russia, Putin oversaw the Second Chechen War. This war was his campaign for the presidency, and he wanted to make sure that he positioned himself as the leader who subdued Chechnya. He gained a lot of popularity during the time because of his tough force on Chechnya. As soon as he managed to push down on Chechnya, the next part of Putin's plan was to choose his puppet leaders. And this is where the Kadyrov family came in. Most people know about Ramzan Kadyrov, but we'll talk about him more later. His late father, Ahmet Kadyrov, actually started out as an Islamic legal scholar, and he and his son were fighting for Chechen independence. However, after some political and religious disagreement with the Chechen pro-independence government after the First Chechen War, he jumped ship and joined Putin's side. During his time as a KGB officer, Putin realized that Russian doctrine in fighting Chechen independence had failed multiple times. So he decided to switch tactics. Instead of fighting the war from the outside, he appointed Ahmed Kadyrov, the former Grand Mufti of Ichkeria, as leader in Chechnya. During the Second Chechen War, Ahmed was a sellout from the jump. He helped pinpoint key Chechen strongholds to the Russian military and created a pro-Russian militia, which was controlled by his family and known as the Kadyrovites. Ahmed was killed in a bombing attack in 2004 and succeeded by his son Ramzan, and to keep the Federal Republic under Russian control, Vladimir Putin has propped up the Kadyrov family to subdue any resistance by free Chechens. All of these tactics did not stop the Chechen rebels who were fighting for freedom. Terrorist attacks became the name of the game, and in 2004 they laid siege to a school in Beslan. Masked men and women wearing bomb belts burst into the Beslan School No. 1 and opened fire into the courtyard as a ceremony marking the beginning of the school year was finishing. The rebels captured over 1,000 hostages, and all of them were crammed into their school sports hall beneath explosives strung from the basketball hoops. Their captors' demand was simple. Russian troops need to pull out of Chechnya, and Chechen prisoners need to be released. As if having forgotten that children were involved, Russia handled the crisis dismally. Russian troops decided to end the siege suddenly on the third day with 2 deadly explosions and intense gunfire. Russian authorities had decided that they were not going to negotiate, and the consequences were detrimental. Zarina Zidikova, who was part of the hostages, recounted the horror in an interview with the BBC. Witnesses described the operations by the Russian security forces as chaotic, and said that the troops used excessive force and heavy weapons. Only one of the hostage-takers was caught alive and put on trial, and 334 people died, 186 of them being children. The siege has been recorded as one of Putin's greatest failures, and it does not help that in 2017, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that Russia has failed in its duty to protect the hostages and used indiscriminate force as the siege collapsed. 20 years later, grief is still a big part of Beslan, and mothers constantly talk about how they believe that Russia should have negotiated with the Chechen rebels. As expected, this only made Putin go harder. Putin used the opportunity to reduce regional autonomy and strengthen his presidency. From then until 2014, the Chechen rebels gave Putin a headache. In 2005, Putin's puppet leader, Ahmed Kadyrov, was assassinated, and investigations show that Chechen separatists were behind it. In November 2006, Chechen rebels bombed the parliament of the Chechen Republic because they believed that it was a symbol of pro-Russian forces. About 60 people were injured and about 14 people were killed. The Chechen rebels did not hide behind anyone for this attack, and Shamil Basayev, a Chechen leader, and a Chechen separatist group known as Riyad Us Salihin Brigade were proudly behind the bombing. This did not go down well with Putin, who does not like to look stupid, so he further pushed down on Grozny with increasing patrols and surveillance. Putin could not pretend that things were stable in the region, and again in 2009, the Chechen rebels struck again. On November 27th, a high-speed train traveling from Moscow to St. Petersburg was bombed. This was a very important attack with a clear message, because everybody knows that Moscow and St. Petersburg are considered the 2 capitals of Russia. Around 130 people were hurt in the blast, which hit the last 3 carriages of the Moscow to St. Petersburg Nevsky Express. After the first explosion, as officials inspected the scene near the town of Bologoye, around 400 kilometers or about 250 miles northwest of Moscow, another explosion wounded an investigator. An Islamist group in the North Caucasus said it was behind the bombing, claiming it had been ordered by Russia's most wanted man, Chechen separatist leader Doku Umarov. This man was a huge thorn in Putin's side for a hot minute, and he was behind a lot of the terrorist bombings that took place in the 2000s. In 2011, the Domodedovka airport was bombed, injuring 173 people and killing 37. When the Russian authorities carried out their investigations, they came across CCTV footage of the bombing being carried out by Magomed Yevlogiv, a 20-year-old from Ingushetia. The bombing was led by Doku Umarov, the Chechen rebel leader, and the purpose was to disrupt Russia's transport system. After this, Chechen rebel activity died down a little bit due to a mass killing of a lot of Chechen leaders by the new puppet leader Ramzan Kadyrov. While the rebels focused a lot of their terrorist attacks on key locations, another target for them was Putin. Between 2004 and 2014, so many attempts were made against Putin's life with the purpose of completely ending him. The most reported one came in 2012, after the election that he was positioned to win again. The FSB uncovered a plan and detained 2 plotters in Ukraine's Black Sea port of Odessa after an explosion at an apartment in the city that killed another alleged plotter. Their investigation showed that the men were planning on using landmines along the route that Putin's motorcade passed by in the hopes of blowing him up. The 2 suspects claimed that they were attacking on behalf of an Islamic State in the Russian Northern Caucasus that was led by Doku Umarov. Finally, in 2014, Russia's Federal Security Service, FSB, killed Moscow's most wanted man, Islamist insurgency leader Doku Umarov, in a combat operation. The death of Umarov was a breakthrough for Putin in the fight against the Caucasus Emirate, and it seems that for now he has managed to quiet the storm. And while that storm lies brewing silently, Putin has had his hands full with the war that he started in Ukraine. The interesting thing about all this is the fact that somehow his problems have followed him. The war between Russia and Chechnya has moved to Ukraine, and both troops are fighting on opposing ends. The Kadyrovsky, Ramzan's army, are fighting for Putin, while Chechen rebels fight on the side of Ukraine.
These Chechens are some of Vladimir Putin's oldest enemies and Ukraine's fiercest allies. They're fighting a holy war against the Russians, says their commander Mansour, and showing them no mercy.
I have no pity for them at all, because God gave everyone a brain for thinking. If he is not thinking, he shouldn't walk on the earth. He belongs below the ground.
The Kadyrovsky militia was formed in the 2000s and was meant to combat the forces of the Chechen separatists in Chechnya. In 2014, they fought alongside Russia in eastern Ukraine, and they have been a part of Russian military operations against ISIS. This militia group is very notorious, and human rights groups, witnesses, and survivors have accused them of extrajudicial killings, kidnappings, and the torture of Kadyrov's rivals and critics, as well as religious hardliners and LGBT Chechens. When the war came up, Ramzan Kadyrov saw it as a perfect opportunity to save face. He has been under attack for some assassinations, and he was looking for an opportunity to win public favor again. His troops officially joined the National Guard of Russia and entered Ukraine in 2022. According to Mikhail Sava of Euromaidan SOS, a Ukrainian rights group documenting Russian servicemen's alleged atrocities, active participation in the assault in the first days of the war was a public relations need for Kadyrov. 2 days before the column entered Bucha, Kadyrov addressed 12,000 servicemen in Grozny, ordering them to storm Kyiv. He left them with one message: now Kyiv, and then whoever is going to mess with our side. At least 1,200 Kadyrovsky entered Ukraine in late February, according to Ukrainian intelligence, and hundreds more are believed to have joined them later. Unfortunately for the Kadyrovsky, they did not get the successful invasion that their leader was fighting for. In October of 2022, Ramzan Kadyrov acknowledged that there were some heavy losses in his ranks after some artillery shelling by Kyiv's troops. He told Telegram that a lot of Chechen units had been taken out in the Kherson region. How they had gotten taken out was really an act of sheer stupidity. The Chechen unit in southern Ukraine had given their location away via photos on social networks, and this had guided Ukrainian forces right to their location. Of course, Ramzan did not want to take on the blame for this incident, so he shifted the blame onto Russian army leadership, especially Prigozhin, who he claimed was too soft on the Ukrainian forces. At some point, Kadyrov was even boldly calling for the use of nuclear weapons against Ukraine. On the other side of the battle line, we also have the Sheikh Mansour Battalion, led by Mansour, which is one of at least 2 all-Chechen battalions fighting in Ukraine against Russia. In early March of 2022, these Chechens were among the 20,000 foreign fighters that the Ukrainian government estimated to have joined its forces. This group of rebels was not afraid to rough it up, and declared that they were ready to fight Russian forces as well as against other ethnic Chechen soldiers who had been sent to fight on behalf of Russia. The group spoke to NPR, but they were very secretive about their numbers because they did not want to be attacked by the Kremlin-backed Chechens. Estimates show that their numbers are at least in the hundreds of men. One thing the men spoke about freely was the fact that they were not traumatized by what they saw. In Ukraine, they watched Russian soldiers shoot civilians, indiscriminately shelled schools and apartment buildings, and terrorized towns and villages they had occupied. One of the soldiers in the battalion stated, "The tragedies of Ukraine and Bucha and Mariupol are nothing compared to what we have experienced growing up. The Russians leveled our cities and villages to the ground." Their leader, Mansour, was only 13 years old when Russian soldiers destroyed his village of Samashki during the First Chechen Wars. They burned Mansour's neighbors alive in their homes, threw grenades into basements, and executed men. Mansour was among the 200,000 Chechens who fled to Turkey and Europe in the 2000s. Mansour, who was 40 years old during the time of this interview, confidently spoke about how he grew up in a war and how it shaped who he was. In 2023, more volunteer fighters also entered the war on the side of Ukraine. When the Russian troops began advancing closer to Kyiv, these volunteers joined in and became one of Ukraine's strongest units. In the northeast, they were behind the successful counteroffensive, and these victories have given hope that they can eventually defeat Russia in Ukraine. One soldier with a call sign MAGA declared that the objective was to liberate Ukraine and then totally liberate Chechnya. The Chechens were also joined by a number of Crimean Tatars, a Muslim minority from the peninsula that Russia seized in 2014. Tens of thousands of Crimean Tatars were deported from their homeland by Joseph Stalin, and they believe that this fight in Ukraine could lead to their own victory too. Another pro-Kyiv group of volunteers who were loyal to Djokhar Dudayev, the late Chechen leader, were also amongst the numbers fighting for Ukraine. They called themselves the Dudayev Battalion, and are the sworn enemies of Chechen forces who back Putin. This makes it very clear that Putin's actions are coming back to bite him. All of these groups of people who were wounded by Russia's terror in the northern Caucasus are banding together to come back and take it down. The domino effect of this is that when Ukraine wins this war, all of these other regions will have the courage to tear away from Russia. After hearing about such a broken and troubled history, you cannot help wanting to root for the underdogs. The real question that everybody wants an answer to is whether Chechnya can break free and if Kadyrov is a real Putin ally. Putin's might in Chechnya is really resting on how well Ramzan Kadyrov is able to keep the Chechen rebels in line. This is a bit worrying when you follow how he leads. Kadyrov is a very controversial figure, and his social media presence has caused him a lot of trouble. The question is, does Putin need someone this volatile beside him at this point in time? Kadyrov grew up in a religious family that adhered to the Northern Caucasus tradition form of Islam called Sufism, and he has consistently used Sufism as a tool in Chechnya. He promotes a lot of Islamic values and uses his supporters to demonstrate his power. He has worked hard to build mosques and religious schools, and he also dictates religious public conduct for the population. Kadyrov's agenda is to wipe out secularist communist rule and re-Islamicize Chechnya. Putin utilizes this agenda to demonstrate respect for Islam and gain trust with the Muslim world. Wanting to get into the good graces of the international community, Kadyrov declared that he would send a peacekeeping mission into Gaza in support of the Palestinian struggle. He also justifies the Chechen units in Ukraine by stating they are participating in a holy jihad against Western Satanist ideology. One of the major problems that Putin is experiencing is that he is receiving backlash for Kadyrov's actions. Because he is Putin's foot soldier, the things he does reflect negatively on the Kremlin. One of the biggest scandals to Kadyrov's name is his crackdown on the LGBTQ community. Putin also has to realize that the current support that he is getting from Kadyrov is conditional. His father was a traitor, and Putin should not expect anything different from his son. Kadyrov and his associates will continue to support Putin for now because, under his rule, they've achieved an unprecedented level of autonomy in the increasingly centralized Russian state. Putin and Ramzan have a personal understanding that allowed Putin to offer him more power. In return for Kadyrov's zealous loyalty and his largely successful efforts in suppressing the North Caucasian insurgency, Putin has given him nearly complete control of Chechnya. For as long as he has the power he has now, he's willing to play along with Putin's drum. However, we also need to consider what the loss of Ukraine will do to this relationship. If Putin loses Ukraine, he will fall, and this means that Kadyrov will fall too. Already he is witnessing the failures in the war, and we must not think that he is not preparing to make his exit from Putin's graces. By now, we know that everybody who allies with Putin is doing it conditionally. China has already begun to distance itself, and North Korea is only doing the same because it needs someone in its corner. Putin must not mistake Chechnya's current actions for undying loyalty. Chechnya and Russia have a very long and complex history. Right now, it appears that Putin has been able to silence the noise, but there is always something bubbling underneath the surface. The resurgence of Chechen fighters on the front lines in Ukraine must be a reminder to Putin that the Chechen rebels are simply waiting for their opportunity to fight back. The war in Ukraine is pivotal for a lot of Putin's territorial regions. They are watching on and realizing that as the Kremlin gets weaker, there will be an opportunity for them to pull away. It all feels like time has been turned back, and it's back to 1991 when the Soviet Union dissolved. If Putin is not careful, he will be remembered as the leader who tore the Russian Federation apart.